Hello and welcome to my channel. If this is the first video of mine that you are watching, but if it is not, welcome back. It is finally time for me to film my 2025 Whiskies, which is my version of my best books of the year. So I have 11 categories, and this year, unlike in previous years, I've only nominated 3 books per category. And that is because in previous years, I tend to film upwards of 2 hours of footage, and then my final edit is around an hour. So I'm hoping that this year will be a little bit shorter with only 35 books or so that I'm going to talk about, because I do have a few honorable mentions too. But I am so excited to take a look back at last year's reading and talk about what books were my absolute favorite. Unlike other best books of the year videos as well, my period is a little bit different because I am looking at the books that I read between December 1st, 2024 and November 30th, 2025. And that's just to give myself a little bit of leeway in December to really sit down and take a look back and contemplate and analyze and determine which books should go in which category or multiple categories, and have a good think about what books I think belong in this video and which book deserves my best overall or my best whiskey of 2025. I've gone out, I've selected a whiskey for 2025, which I am so excited to share with you later at the end of this video, and to cheers with you and toast to a wonderful year of reading. So without further ado, it is time to dive into my first category, which is going to be my best debut or new to me author. So as has been the case the last couple of years, I didn't read a whole lot of debut authors last year, but I did read a handful of new to me authors. So the first new to me author is not a debut author by any stretch of the imagination, because that is Maehrer, who is a Welsh-Canadian historical romance author that I have had on my radar for literal years. I wrote an article about her a couple of years ago, and I was really intrigued by the summaries of the books I was reading about. Finally, I picked up a book by her last year, the first book in her Bedouin Saga series, which draws a lot of comparisons with Julia Quinn's Bridgerton series, because we're following a large family and each book follows a different member of that family. I think there are 6 books in the Bedouin Saga. I adored the Bedouin Saga, and I really enjoyed the family dynamic that Balogh depicts within those books. I read a few other books besides the Bedouin Saga last year too, and I was just so excited to discover a historical romance author that I really enjoyed, because at this point I have read the back catalog to all my other favorites. So I'm always searching out new authors who have a plethora of books in their back catalog to read and to enjoy. Then the closest nomination that I have to an actual debut author is Nicole Maehrer, and this is actually the sequel. But Assistant to the Villain came out in 2024, and I read that book for the first time in 2025 and almost immediately sought out the sequel. This is a cozy fantasy romance, very low stakes, very lighthearted, very enjoyable, and I would say it borders on the line with humorous fantasy, which is not something that always works for me, but in this case it absolutely did. I would say, and I have previously said, that Assistant to the Villain is much more character driven, whereas with Apprentice to the Villain, we're now finally diving in a little bit more to the plot. And I have not read the 3rd book in this series yet, but it is on my list, and I really enjoyed discovering Nicole Maehrer last year. Then finally, the 3rd best new to me author that I read for the first time last year is Robert Jackson Bennett. I read The Tainted Cup last year, and I have not gotten to the sequel yet, but I loved The Tainted Cup. It was really unlike anything else that I had read. It is a epic fantasy in this Asiatic inspired world, but it's also a murder mystery. And that was the premise that got me to pick up The Tainted Cup. The comparisons to Holmes and Watson and the comparisons to Agatha Christie, those type of mysteries. There was the big 11th hour reveal, all within this really rich, interesting fantasy setting. And I absolutely want to pick up the sequel. And I think the third book is already out or is coming out in 2026. So that is on my TBR as well. So those are the best new to me authors that I read last year. Mary Balogh, Hannah Nicole Maehrer, and Robert Jackson Bennett. And I loved all three of these authors for different reasons. However, my winner for best new to me author has to be Mary Balogh. I think just because I read 8 books by this author compared to 2 by Maehrer and 1 by Bennett last year, 8 books is a significant amount, and it shows that I really enjoyed their writing and their world. All of these authors write within different genres, so I love them for very different reasons, which I've already said. But I loved Mary Balogh, and I was just so ecstatic to, like I've already said, find a new historical romance author that I really enjoyed. So Mary Balogh was the best new to me author that I enjoyed the most overall, I would say, with 8 books read last year. My next category is my best short read of 2025, and my first nomination is going to be A Kiss for Midwinter by Courtney Milan, which is a holiday novella within the Brothers Sinister series, and this is following a supporting secondary character and was a wonderful character exploration as well as emotional analysis. Milan, within very limited page space, was able to have a pretty deep dive into the shame that we can feel about ourselves and how that at times can negatively impact our opinions of other people. And at the same time, she was able to create this beautiful love story that took place at Christmas time. So I really enjoyed A Kiss for Midwinter. I also really enjoyed Talk Sweetly to Me by Courtney Milan, which is my second nomination for Best Short Read of 2025. And this is another Brothers Sinister novella. And in this novella, we are following a female scientist who is a woman of color in London during this time period, and a lovely, endearing Irishman male character. And I loved the growth that Milan was able to depict that our male character went through in his arrival at love and his declaration of love and trying to convince the female main character to give him a chance. I really enjoyed Talk Sweetly to Me. Then finally, my third nomination for Best Short Read of 2025 is A Lantern Left Burning, which I was so lucky to have received an advanced reader's copy of. This is a sapphic romance that takes place in the larger world of Esk, and I adored the world building that Hawthorne was able to do and convey and depict within A Lantern Left Burning. It was very short, but the amount of world building that she was able to eke into this novella was so mesmerizing, so cozy, so comforting. I really enjoyed A Lantern Left Burning. However, my winner of Best Short Read of 2025 is going to be Talk Sweetly to Me. I adored the characters in this novella as well as the love story that they went on. There's a particular scene at the end of this novella in which the male character truly depicts the embodiment of I will not fight for you, but I will support you wholeheartedly and fight alongside you, which is like a micro trope, a very niche trope that I adore. Just the way that he was able to hold himself throughout that scene and fully support our female main character who was enduring horrible racism. It was so well done. And it was only like 100 and some pages. Like, Milan was also my winner for Best Short Read in last year's Whiskies, and maybe she'll be the winner next year too, because I adore what she is able to do within such limited page space. Courtney Milan and her novella Talk Sweetly to Me is my 2025 winner for Best Short Read. Building off of that previous category, my next category is Best Historical Romance. And my first nomination is going to be The Scoundrel Falls Hard by Sophie Jordan, which first, look at this amazing, incredible cover. This is the third book in the Duke Hunt series, and we are following Gwen Cully, who is the female blacksmith in this quaint little town depicted on the cover here, as well as Kellen Fox, who is an absolute scoundrel of a character. Within this book, there is also a marriage of convenience and the unlikely love pairing of a female blacksmith, which is another micro trope I adore and would love to read more about, and Kellen Fox, who is a scoundrel due to hang unless Gwen comes to his aid. So I really enjoyed The Duke Hunt by Sophie Jordan, and Sophie Jordan is another historical romance author that I love. My next nomination is The Heiress Effect by Courtney Milan, which is the second book in the Brothers Sinister series. So you might be able to detect a pattern that's taking place here, but The Heiress Effect follows Jane Fairfield and Oliver Marshall. And Jane is a woman with a very large dowry who is fighting to remain unmarried and retain her freedom and autonomy, whereas Oliver is the bastard son of a duke who holds himself to the impossible standard of doing everything perfectly. And Jane is a very boisterous character who I enjoyed. And of course, to Oliver, Jane represents all that he is not allowed to do. He's not allowed to be exuberant and loud and boisterous. So there is an unlikely love that begins to develop between the two of them that they're trying to fight, of course, but in the end, there is a happily ever after. Then my third nomination for Best Historical Romance of 2025 is another Milan title, and it is another Brothers Sinister title, and that is The Suffragette Scandal, which is the fourth book in the Brothers Sinister series and the final full-length novel within this series. However, it feels almost like a spin-off of the Brothers Sinister series because we are following Oliver's younger sister, Frederica, or Free, and she runs a newspaper that is very vocal about women's rights and women's right to vote at this time. And the other characters from the series are kind of in her orbit, but she is very much almost the next generation because she's quite a bit younger than Oliver and his Brothers Sinister. So we are following Free as she's being very vocal about the women's suffragette movement. And she meets Mr. Edward Clark, who is a formidable forger and an absolute rogue. And he has every reason not to get involved with Free's cause because he does not want to draw public attention to himself. However, he begins to fall in love with her and he begins to support her and defend her against those who are trying to silence her and who are trying to shut down her newspaper and also physically harm her. It was a really delightful conclusion to this series, but also kind of sequel to this series of sorts. So those are my three nominations for Best Historical Romance: The Scoundrel Falls Hard by Sophie Jordan, The Heiress Effect by Courtney Milan, and The Suffragette Scandal by Courtney Milan. And the winner for Best Historical Romance for me from last year is going to be The Heiress Effect by Courtney Milan. There was such a slow burn throughout this book, and I adore a slow burn, and I loved Oliver from the very first book, so I was so excited to finally get to his love story, and the way that the two characters were able to not compromise, but meet one another as they evolved throughout the course of this novel. I adored so much. The next category that I'm going to talk about are my best fantasy reads from last year. And if you see me looking down at all during this video, I do have my laptop with notes because I have a lot of books to talk about today. But the first book that I'm nominating for Best Fantasy of 2025 is going to be Lord of Emperors by Guy Gabriel Kay. Now, this is not a straight cut and dry fantasy. This is more historical fantasy with magical realism woven in, I would say. This is the second book in the Sarantine Mosaic duology, which is a reimagining of the Byzantine Empire. And we are following a mosaicist, Crispin, who finds himself embroiled in a political time of turmoil and change and upheaval in the capital of the empire. And he is very much reluctant in this time of political turmoil. He doesn't want to be caught up in all of this. He just wants to create art. And this is the conclusion to the duology, and it was very well done. And I really enjoyed Kay's take on the Byzantine Empire with little hints of magic throughout the duology. My next nomination for Best Fantasy Read of last year is Tower of Thorns by Juliette Marillier, which is another historical fantasy. But this fantasy is reimagining a Celtic-inspired world with fae and stronger magic throughout. And this is the second book in the Blackthorn and Grimm trilogy, which I have already spoken about on the channel. I have a full review of the trilogy up, and I really enjoyed this second book in the series. I would say the first book is more about Blackthorn's background and her history, whereas Tower of Thorns is delving into Grimm's backstory, and we're learning more about this silent figure who has been supporting Blackthorn all of this time and acting as a bodyguard, but he has gone through a lot, and learning more about his struggle, his daily struggle, was really compelling and interesting, as was the more... I have one closed door in my apartment right now, and my apartment is a full circle, and Minnie is losing her mind that she can't make the full circle right now. As I was saying, we learn more about Grimm's backstory in Tower of Thorns, and I also really enjoy the more mystical, more traditional folktale setting, I would say, of this book, with it being a tower in the middle of the woods and Blackthorn and Grimm amidst all of these strangers and uncertain who they can trust. Then my final nomination for the best fantasy read of last year is one I've already spoken about, and that is The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is the first book in the Shadow of the Leviathan series, and I've already said that it is an Asiatic-inspired world, and I really enjoyed the way Bennett depicted a complex social structure as well as a complex and very figurative way that the world was laid out. There were the hints of something more supernatural within the first book that I think are going to be delved into a little more in the sequel. But then there is that core of a murder mystery with a much more human threat in the first book. So I really enjoyed The Tainted Cup. And my best fantasy read was actually the hardest to choose because I loved all three of these books so much. In the end, my winner is going to be The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett, just because I would say of my three books, this one is more traditionally fantasy versus Lord of Emperors and Tower of Thorns were much more historical fantasy. And I feel like I've come across this in the last 2 years too. So maybe I need to introduce a 12th category for historical fantasy because I love historical fantasy. But The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett was my best fantasy read of last year. The introduction to this book was about as gory and descriptive as I can take as someone who doesn't read a lot of horror. It was very brutal and almost unexpected. We're also very much just kind of dropped into this world, and we have to figure out where we are and who these characters are to one another and to the worlds in a larger sense for ourselves. And I really, really enjoyed The Tainted Cup, and I absolutely have the sequel on my list to read for 2026. The next category are my best fantasy romance reads of last year, and I read so many fantastic fantasy romance books, but my first nomination is going to be Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross, which is a young adult enemies to lovers fantasy romance. And I really enjoyed this duology. I really read a lot of duologies last year, I find, and I think they're an underrated series. But Ruthless Vows, this takes place during wartime, and it was very reminiscent to our own early 20th century wartime, and it is a slow burn epistolary romance. We're following Roman and Iris, who are wartime correspondents, and there was a lot of romancing of newspapers and being a journalist, and I think that Ross did an incredible job at depicting journalism within the setting of her duology. Sometimes I find that the way journalists and reporters are depicted in fiction grates on my nerves so greatly, but Ross did an incredible job, and I really loved watching Roman and Iris slowly grow to trust one another, care for one another, and love one another. My next nomination is also kind of an epistolary romance because it takes place over the course of journal entries, and that is, of course, Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. And again, this fantasy romance is a little bit reminiscent to our own late 19th, early 20th century time in history, but this is a novel rooted in academia, and we are following along with our main character as she is researching and exploring fae in a country that kind of bears a lot of resemblance to Iceland or perhaps one of the Nordic countries, and one of her colleagues follows her there, and there is something that's a little bit different about him, and we're following those two characters. I really, really enjoyed Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies and the slow burn, again, romance that unfolded across the pages. And then finally, my third nomination for Best Fantasy Romance is another slow burn. There is a theme of what I like in my romances, but this nomination is Den of Wolves by Juliet Marillier. This is the third and final book in the Blackthorn and Grimm trilogy, and where I said the first book is really Blackthorn's book, the second book is Grimm's novel, this third book is a book that is about them, and it is about their relationship, which their relationship is something that a lot of the characters around them don't understand throughout the course of this trilogy, but they care for one another so greatly, and both of them have experienced such horrific trauma that the slow burn and the acceptance and understanding of the yearning they felt for one another was such a great payoff throughout the course of these three books. And I'm going to interrupt myself here to say that Den of Wolves is the best fantasy romance that I read last year because I just loved it so much. I loved the world that Marillier created, which felt very whimsical and reminiscent of familiar folk tales with this Celtic inspired world and with the fae that Grimm and Blackthorn interact with throughout the course of the book. There's also a little kernel of a lesson to be told in each book. I think Marillier does a beautiful job at depicting fantasy in her writing, and I just loved watching Grimm and Blackthorn's relationship evolve and develop throughout the course of the trilogy, and it came to a beautiful conclusion in Den of Wolves. So Den of Wolves is my best fantasy read from last year. Moving from best fantasy romance into my best pairings from last year, there are going to be some shared nominations. And my first nomination is Roman and Iris from the Divine Rivals duology by Rebecca Ross. This is a young adult fantasy romance, like I've already said. So this was such a sweet romance, watching these two characters from two very different worlds get to know one another through magic typewriters and writing letters to one another, not knowing who the other was. And I don't always love when one character knows who the other character is in terms of secret relationships, I guess you could say. But the way that Ross depicted that natural progression of Roman and Iris learning who they were writing to was really beautiful and was really well done. So I loved Roman and Iris. I also think that Ross just did an incredible job at creating their roles as reporters. I really believed it, and I really loved the lengths that each other was willing to go for the other person. My second nomination is going to be Blackthorn and Grimm from the Blackthorn and Grimm trilogy. Again, Den of Wolves is the final book in that trilogy. I adored the relationship that Grimm and Blackthorn had, and I loved each stage of their relationship. From the very first book, they are imprisoned in the same jailhouse, and they don't really interact with one another besides knowing that that person is across in a different cell. And then as they embark on this adventure, they are very, I wouldn't even say allies. They're very reluctant. They're not companions. They just happen to be going in the same direction. And then the excuses, even though I don't like that word, but then there are reasons that begin to become convenient for why they continue to head in the same direction. And I think there is something to be said about how they have a shared experience in that jail cell, and no one else can really understand what they endured. And then also each of them have the reason why they were in that jail cell and their own traumas that led to that scenario. So there is a shared trust that develops between Blackthorn and Grimm throughout the course of the trilogy that I think is really, really beautiful. And I think that Maehrer did a wonderful job at conveying a realistic depiction of trauma and romance following trauma. My third nomination is a little bit more lighthearted because I am going back to the Brothers Sinister series by Courtney Milan, and it took me a very long time to decide which couple I wanted to nominate, because I didn't want to nominate more than one couple from the series. So I wanted to choose who was my favorite of the 4 full-length novels and 4 novellas as well, I think. And my nomination is Sebastian and Violet from The Countess Conspiracy. And I haven't yet spoken about The Countess Conspiracy, which is the 3rd book in the Brothers Sinister series. And we are following Violet, who is a countess, who is a widow, and Sebastian, who is the scoundrel type character, and he is one of the leading voices in the scientific community. He is spoken right alongside Darwin, and because he researches and speaks on evolution and everything that pertains to evolution, he is one of the most hated members of English society. But Violet and Sebastian have known each other since they were young children, and they are very intrinsically connected within the scientific community. And that's all I'm going to say about it, because I think for the best experience, you should read the whole series in chronological order for yourself. But Sebastian and Violet went from friends to allies to having a fallen out and then back together. And again, it was a complex relationship that spanned many, many years, and Milan absolutely did it justice within the Countess conspiracy. And I think of all of the couples I read about in that series, Sebastian and Violet were my favorites. I absolutely adored them. I think Milan did an incredible job at depicting a complex, realistic relationship. It was another slow burn. There was a lot of yearning, and there was past trauma that had to be understood and reckoned with before a new relationship could develop or flourish. And I think Milan just did an incredible job at that slow burn and that realistic acceptance and growing together of Sebastian and Violet. I really, really enjoyed their relationship. So this was another hard one because I loved Sebastian and Violet's relationship, and it took place within a more traditional romance, I would say. However, my best pairing of 2025 has to be Blackthorn and Grimm. Again, I've spoken about this series at such length and these characters at such length, but I think they are beautifully complex characters who feel so realistic, and I loved reading about them, and I kind of miss them a little bit. So I need to pick up another Maehrer book. There is a sequel to the Blackthorn and Grimm trilogy following the next generation that I think I'm going to pick up sooner rather than later. Famous last words. I say this all of the time, but maybe this spring I will pick up the next book in the next series. The next category that I'm going to talk about is the best plot twist. And this one is a little bit tricky because I absolutely do not want to reveal any spoilers. So this is going to be a spoiler-free discussion about plot twists. I'm not going to talk about what happens, but I'm going to talk about something happening. So if this doesn't interest you, skip ahead to the next category. But if you want to learn about the books that had me sitting up and gasping out loud, keep watching. My first nomination is going to be Bloodsong by Anthony Ryan. This is a military epic fantasy. It is the first book that Ryan published, and it is one that I really, really enjoyed. We are following Valen Al-Sora, who enrolls in a military academy, and this book takes place across multiple decades, and there's also a lot of reflecting back to when he was a child and when he was at this military academy. There's a lot of familiar coming of age tropes within Bloodsong, but there was one reveal at the very end that had me gasping and genuinely had me flipping back through the pages of this book thinking, how long has that happened? How long has this been happening for? So I really enjoyed Bloodsong, and I really, really enjoyed the twist at the end, which took what was a very familiar military epic fantasy and elevated it to that next level for me and made me want to pick up the sequel, which hopefully I will do at some point this year. My next nomination for Best Plot Twist is going to be Onyx Storm by Rebecca Yarros. This is the third book in the Imperium series, which follows Violet and Xaden. If you haven't heard about the Imperium series, which has Fourth Wing and Iron Flame and Onyx Storm, I'm very surprised. I wasn't blown away by Onyx Storm. I felt like it was a little bit of a filler. I didn't love this book as much as I had perhaps hoped to. However, those final pages, that final reveal, that final plot twist, Yarros absolutely came for our throats with that one. And after a little bit of plodding along throughout the majority of this book, that final scene had me gasping out loud and was definitely one of the best plot twists that I read last year. Then my third nomination for Best Plot Twist is going to be 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City by K.J. Parker. And this is a humorous fantasy, which I am always vocal about not always working for me, but Parker I have read 3 different works by him, and he manages to walk that line of witty intelligence that doesn't talk down or condescend to the reader. He walks that fine line beautifully for me, and I love his humorous fantasies. I was racing through 16 Ways to figure out how our protagonist was going to pull things off. He is trying to defend a walled city, and he is very much not the king, not the ruler, not a military figure, but he finds himself in the right place at the wrong time, or the wrong place at the right time, and it becomes his responsibility to defend this city. And I was so intrigued as to how he was going to pull it off, and perhaps because I went into this book and this larger series not knowing very much about it, the ending took me completely aback. If Onyx Storm was a throat punch, 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City was a simultaneous throat punch, gut punch, and just being taken out at the knees. So I think you might be able to gather that 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City is the winner of Best Plot Twist for 2025 for me. This was so enjoyable, and again, for being a humorous fantasy, Parker plays with more serious themes and topics of conversation and analysis. I really enjoyed 16 Ways. I went into this not knowing what to expect, not knowing very much about this book or the series, and I was so pleasantly taken aback and surprised and delighted by it. The next category that I have to nominate books for is one that I always love coming back to, and that is Best Quote. I am someone who writes down quotes that stick out to me whilst I'm reading, and I have found throughout the last 3 years, there has always been a quote that when it comes time to plan this category, immediately jumps into my head. And I think there is something so beautiful about an author leaving that lasting impact on me. So the best quote nominations I have for this year, the first one is going to be from The Suffragette Scandal by Courtney Milan. I loved the Brothers Sinister series. And this takes place during a conversation between Free and Edward on the fight for women's rights. And Edward says to Free that it is like trying to empty the Thames with a thimble. But Free isn't alone in that fight. She says to him, "You see a river rushing by without end. You see a sad collection of women with thimbles, all dipping out an inconsequential amount. But we're not trying to empty the Thames. Look at what we are doing with the water we remove. It doesn't go to waste. We're using it to water our gardens sprout by sprout. We're growing bluebells and clovers where once there was a desert. All you see is the river, but I care about the roses." And I genuinely just got chills reading that for the upteenth time. My next nomination for Best Quote is going to come from Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson. And I kind of have two because both of these are callbacks to earlier quotes in the series. And I think that perhaps speaks to my general opinion on Wind and Truth, which I still haven't really spoken about on the channel. But of course, it was such an impactful moment to hear "I'll see what I can do" again, as well as this callback quote. "I will not lie and promise you that all future days will be warm, but you will be warm again, and that is another thing entirely to promise." Again, I get chills. Like, it's such an impactful quote, such a beautiful quote, and such a hopeful quote. Then my final nomination for Best Quote of 2025 is going to come from Den of Wolves by Juliet Marillier, and it reads, "When you felt sad or angry or hopeless, a story could help. a story could lead you into a different world for a while. It might be a world where a foolish youngest son could turn into a brave and clever hero, or a beaten young woman would end up as a wise leader of folk. And when the story was ended and that world was gone, you still had the idea of it inside you, like a flame that didn't go out, even when the bad things rattled and swirled and screamed, and worse, oh, much worse, when they whispered and goaded and tormented. I think that is beautiful language. Like, I think it is just generally beautiful writing, as well as the sentiment that Maehrer is conveying within that larger paragraph. It's such, again, a beautiful, hopeful message. There is a theme throughout the quotes that stick out to me most. And I will say that for best quote, it was so hard to decide between that quote from Den of Wolves and the earlier quote from the suffragette scandal. But I chose these winners a couple of months ago now, back in December, and my winner for best quote of 2025 is The Suffragette Scandal by Courtney Milan. And I think filming this at the end of February, beginning of March, it feels so even more relevant. The metaphor of fighting for women's rights being like trying to empty the Thames with a thimble is one that stuck with me long after I closed the final page, and then Free's further explanation or exploration of that quote of, yes, that is an insurmountable task, but you can't become overwhelmed by the insurmountable task. You have to focus on what is in front of you, who is beside you, and what you can do with what you are given. I think that is a beautiful, beautiful quote. And I also think the Den of Wolves quote of how we get hope and how we find inspiration within the world of stories is one that rings so true for me as well. So this isn't a tandem win because I didn't actually have any tandem wins this year, but it was a very close call for best quote between the suffragette scandal and Den of Wolves. But I do award best quote of 2025 to the suffragette scandal by Courtney Milan. Moving along into the 9th category, we are slowly approaching the end and the best overall book from 2025, which will be awarded the Whisky. But this category is going to be the best nonfiction read that I read last year. I always have a goal to read 12 nonfiction books, and I don't think I have hit that in the last several years. I think I read 9 nonfiction books last year, perhaps, but I love to read more nonfiction, and I love to read, as you will see, a variety of nonfiction books. So my first nomination is going to be Valkyrie, The Women of the Viking World by Johanna Katrine Friedrichsdottir. And this was a very captivating, compelling, well-written look at women in the Viking world and the disparity between the stories that were told and are told about Vikings and Valkyries and the like, the disparity between that myth and legend and what is in the written record of women within the Viking world, and the day-to-day reality for most women during that time period. I think Friedrichsdottir did a wonderful job at looking at that contrast and analyzing it. I also really enjoyed how she laid out the book, because we follow women from birth to being a young child, into adolescence, into adulthood, and then becoming a senior woman within their larger clan. And the book unfolded chronologically as we pass with these women through each phase of their life, and I really enjoyed how Friedrichsdottir laid out the book like that. My next nomination is going to be All Together Now, A Newfoundlander's Light Tales for Heavy Times by Alan Doyle. And this was written during 2020 for certain, and perhaps not published until 2021, but this is a reflection, an autobiography of sorts of Alan Doyle sharing stories from his life on the road as the frontman for Great Big Sea, as well as his upbringing on the Rock in Newfoundland. And I remember I listened to this in tandem, the audiobook, which Doyle narrates, and the physical copy, and this had me laughing out loud, and I had such a wonderful, wonderful time listening and reading to All Together Now. It is absolutely a compendium of light tales for what are still quite heavy times, and I really enjoyed this book. I could listen to Alan Doyle talk just all day, and I'm actually going to see him in concert in the next week or so, probably after this video goes live. I'll have already gone. So I love Alan Doyle, I love Great Big Sea. I really enjoyed All Together Now. Then my final nomination is We Should All Be Feminist by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And again, I listened to the audiobook version of this and I loved it. It is so short. It is an essay, really. It's not even a novella. The audiobook was only 45 minutes, perhaps, and it's so short, but I think We Should All Be Feminist. It should just be mandatory reading or mandatory listening. It was such a good overview. It explains the concept of feminism and why it is so important and why that conversation needs to be happening within all circles of relationships and between everyone. It can't just be a conversation by women about women within women's circles, because we get it. We've lived this basically our whole lives. And I think Adichie did a great job at furthering that conversation and using examples from her own lived experiences about the conversations, the harder conversations that she's had. So my winner for Best Nonfiction, because it is so short and because I so highly recommend it, is going to be We Should All Be Feminists. If you want just a general overview, a very quick overview of feminism and why it is important and why it matters, please pick up We Should All Be Feminists. And then if you want a little bit of reprieve from heavier topics and more serious topics that impact the lives of half of the population, perhaps pick up All Together Now, because I think that is a great way to follow up the conversation on feminism. And if you pick up the audiobook, you will delight in hearing Alan Doyle read to you. My apologies if the lighting has changed tremendously, but we have finally made it to the penultimate category, which is going to be the best cover. And this category, perhaps even more so than the other ones, is definitely a personal opinion. I have a particular taste when it comes to covers, which you will be able to ascertain when I go through the nominations. But this year I've actually wrote down who the artist is behind each cover, because I think it is so very important to give those artists the credit where it is due, especially in the wake of the AI slop that I have seen dominating bookstores, which I find just gross and disgusting. But also, when I was a little girl and my mom was reading me stories, my mom would always make a point to read out the illustrator's name too. Right after the author's name, who it was by, she would always tell me who the book was illustrated by. My mom was an artist and that was very important to her, and I feel like it is very important for me to honor her memory and also honor the artist behind some of my favorite covers from last year. So my first nomination for the best cover of 2025 is going to be Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. And I don't actually own a copy of this book, so I'll just put a photo of the cover here. But I love this cover. I especially love the border that runs around the outside. The art artist behind this cover is Vera Dremanowski, and the art director is Rachel Ake-Kuek. And Vera on her website actually details some of the notes that she received in the brief, and it was to be highly decorative, Art Nouveau inspired with a sinister twist to reflect the themes of the books. And I think Vera absolutely nailed that brief. She did such a stunning job, and I would recommend, if you find this cover to be very pretty and very compelling, check out her website because she shows a few different options that she presented to the team. And I just found that to be so inspiring and beautiful and interesting. I do own a copy of my next nomination, which is Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson. Of course, Sanderson is renowned, I think, for his gorgeous covers with the Stormlight Archives. He invests such time and effort and dollars into creating art that matches the quality of the world he is creating. I think Michael Whelan, who is the artist behind this cover, did an incredible job and does an incredible job for all of the Stormlight Archive art he creates. He knocked it out of the park with this cover, and I find it absolutely captivating and stunning, and it just conveys the tone and atmosphere of this book so beautifully well. Then my third nomination for Best Cover of 2025 is going to be Dreamer's Pool by Juliette Marillier, and the cover artist for this book is Arantxa Sestao, and I think they did just an incredible job, and they are also the artist behind Dragon Unleashed by Grace Draven, which is a previous Whiskey winner for Best Cover. I think perhaps the first Whiskies Dragon Unleashed won Best Cover, I'm pretty sure. But I think this cover is just so stunning. I love it, and I find it to convey the whimsical fae world that Marillier depicts within the Blackthorn and Grimm trilogy so very well. I think this conveys the atmosphere, the darker tones and nature of the book very well. But my winner for the best cover of 2025 is going to be Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson. I think this is just a stunning work of art. Obviously, all three covers that I've nominated today are their own pieces of art respectively, but I do just adore this cover. And also, Wind and Truth is not a book that I've spoken about very often in the Whiskies for 2025, even though it came out during my nomination period for the 2025 Whiskies. So I did want Wind and Truth to have a win almost, and I think the category that it nails best of all of the categories I've spoken about today is probably Best Cover. I enjoyed Wind and Truth. There are a few things that I have issue with that I am eager to see how Sanderson handles within the second arc. But in terms of the cover, in terms of what Michael Whelan created, he did an incredible job. Sanderson is an incredible art director in creating this cover or describing what he wanted with this cover. So my best cover for 2025 is going to be Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson. Now, as we near the end of the 2025 Whiskies, I do want to take just a moment and talk about some honorable mentions. I read so many incredible books last year, and there were a few of them that just didn't quite fit in to one of the categories I've spoken about today, or they would have fit into a category if I had nominated 5 books, but as it stands, trying to limit myself a little bit, they just didn't quite make the cut for some reason or another. And the first honorable mention that I want to talk about is Clockwork Boys by T. Kingfisher. I read so many Kingfisher books I think mostly towards the end of last year, and I've also started 2026 with so many great Kingfisher reads that Kingfisher in general just needs to be an honorable mention for last year. I reread the Saint of Steel series last year too, and that is one stipulation that I have in place for myself. I don't nominate any rereads. Otherwise, the Saint of Steel series would have probably swept the 2025 Whiskies. But I read The Clockwork Boys for the first time last year, and this includes the Clock Tower Wars and the Wonder Engine. It is a duology that takes place within the same world as the Saint of Steel books, the world of the White Rat. And this is kind of a fantasy romance. It is an adventure story. The duology should very much be seen as one larger work, but I loved these books. I found them to be so entertaining, so enjoyable. I loved all of our characters. I loved the relationships that developed on the page, both romantic and platonic. I think Kingfisher does a wonderful job at depicting relationships and exploring emotions and creating adventure and tension. I really, really enjoyed The Clockwork Boys, and I would highly recommend that you pick up this book if you haven't read this book yet by Kingfisher. Then my next honorable mention has to be The Countess Conspiracy by Courtney Milan. And this is a little bit of me bending my own rules because I have already spoken about The Countess Conspiracy. I nominated Sebastian and Violet as one of my best pairings for 2025, but I didn't nominate the book. So I wanted to have the opportunity to talk a little bit more about The Countess Conspiracy by Courtney Milan. I've spoken about the relationship that takes place on the page, which I found to be so captivating, so beautiful, so raw and realistic. I really enjoyed the relationship between Sebastian and Violet. I also really enjoyed the plot and the setting. Milan explores the scientific community as well as the expectations of women and men within society and what those roles mean and how they limit us if we subscribe to them entirely. She also does a lot of research for her historical romance books, and I loved reading her author's notes. I think it is the sign of a brilliant author if I am just as eager to hear about the process in the author's note at the end of the book as I am to have read the book itself. And that was the case with Courtney Milan in every book I've read by her. So I loved learning a little bit more about the history that she used as the foundation for this book and the exploration that took place on the page of exploring the roles that Violet had presented to her and her decision to go against societal expectations. I really enjoyed The Countess Conspiracy. Then finally, my third honorable mention is going to be Isabel by Guy Gabriel Kay. Isabel is actually the first contemporary story that I've read by Kay. I've spoken about Kay many, many times on this channel, and I've already spoken about him in this video, but he is one of my favorite authors. Typically, he writes fantasy stories that evoke a time in history that is very reminiscent to our own. For example, in the Sarantine Mosaic, he is depicting a fantastical version of the Byzantine Empire. He blends magical realism with historical fiction, with fantasy, and his writing itself is so beautiful. He really taps into the emotions of his characters, and he has such a beautiful way of creating these turns of phrase that really stick with me as a reader. Like I perhaps have already said, Isabel is a contemporary story, so he's not really depicting a historical time period, except he is, because there is almost some time travel-esque elements. I found this book to be so captivating and so interesting. It does have a little bit of a love triangle in it, which is not a trope that I enjoy at all, really. But Kay has been the author who has managed to kind of win me over the most with that trope, because he depicts the complexity of love and of people as individuals so beautifully well. I will say that the main character in this book is a teenage boy, and it is interesting the way Kay is telling a story that is a tale as old as time within a contemporary setting, because a Roman soldier at 16 is very, very different to a 16-year-old in the modern day. The way that they held themselves, the expectations that society had on them. So there was something uncomfortable about reading a 16-year-old boy, a child, having these expectations thrust upon him and going through the motions of this relationship that felt far, far too mature for him. But Isabel was such a captivating read that really made me think harder and analyze what I was reading, that it has to be an honorable mention for 2025. And with that, we have finally made it to the last category, my best overall read, or the Whiskey of 2025. And this is a book that I have spoken about already in this video. So I'd love for you to let me know if you think that you have guessed it correctly, because I have gone on and on about it just a little bit. But without further ado, drum roll please. My best overall read from last year, and what will be crowned the Whiskey of 2025, is going to be, find the right one here, Tower of Thorns by Juliet Marillier. But truly, it's going to be the Blackthorn and Grimm trilogy. I love each book in this trilogy. I loved Tower of Thorns because we had the opportunity to delve a little bit deeper, and whilst this was very much Grimm's book, we learned so much about Blackthorn in this book too. I loved the progression and development that their relationship took within Tower of Thorns, and how that came to a beautiful, beautiful conclusion with Den of Wolves. And of course, if you know me, I have a particular soft spot in my heart for the first book of any series. So all of that would be remiss without giving Dreamer's Pool its accolades too. This is the book in which we meet these characters for the very first time, and I very quickly fell in love with them, and I just wanted them to be safe and healthy and happy. And by the end of the trilogy, they got there, and it was a beautiful, beautiful journey. So my best overall read from last year is the Blackthorn and Grimm trilogy. I have already spoken about this series so much, so I'm sure that that might not be a surprise. And of course, it is the only book from last year, books, that I kind of marked up and annotated. So let me know again if you guessed correctly for my Whiskey of 2025. And with the books announced, it is now time to reveal what my Whiskey is of 2025. This year's Whiskey is one that I set out to find with kind of specific parameters. If you've watched either of the previous Whiskies videos, I do always choose a Canadian whiskey. I like celebrating Canadian authors, Canadian culture, and Canadian beverages in the form of whiskey. But this year I wanted to find a whiskey from my home province of New Brunswick, which is a lot harder than I anticipated. There are quite a few distilleries in Ontario, as well as out west in Alberta, where we do have those grain farms. but I did find a New Brunswick whiskey that I am so excited to try, and it is Down River Whiskey, which is a harvest blend multi-grain whiskey. This is a small batch whiskey. I also love the packaging. It is stunning. And you can see down at the bottom what batch and what bottle this is. So I think they did an incredible job. It says on the back here that Harvest Blend is a grain whiskey made by blending our own corn, rye, barley, wheat, and oat whiskeys. Fermented, distilled, and aged in our own first and second fill oak barrels and bottled at our distillery in the heart of the St. John River Valley of New Brunswick, Canada. No flavors or colors added, and it is this beautiful, rich amber color. So let me crack into this and we will give it a taste together. I actually picked up this bottle several weeks ago now, and it has just been sitting on my bar cart ever since, and I've been so eager and intrigued to see what it tastes like. Satisfying pop. Good smell. Cheers. That is so smooth. I would say this is, I don't know if I can call a whiskey subtle, but this feels like a very subtle, smooth whiskey. It is 43%, but yes, this is so smooth. It's not overpowering in the slightest. I'm not a whiskey connoisseur or anything like that. I just know what I typically tend to like. And this doesn't have any, I would say this doesn't have any frills. Last year's whiskey was aged. It was a barefaced whiskey, and that had a lot of smokiness added into it. So it had a very distinct taste that almost felt or tasted like a scotch. This is very pared back in comparison, but absolutely delicious. And I'm so proud that this is New Brunswick. So that is this year's 2025 whiskeys. Let me put all of this down first of all. So the Blackthorn and Grimm trilogy were the best overall books that I read last year, and Down River Whiskey by Moonshine Creek Distillery is my whiskey of 2025. I'm not sure how long this video is going to end up being, but thank you very, very much for sticking through with me until the very end. I greatly appreciate it. As always, let me know if you have read any of the books I've spoken about today. Obviously, there has been a winner for each category, but each book that I've nominated is a book that I really, really enjoyed reading over the past 12 months or so. I'd love to hear what your favorite book from last year would be, or if you were going to nominate books per any of the categories I've spoken about today, what would be your top 3? Let me know down in a comment below because I'd love to discuss that all with you. For now, this is going to be it for me. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I will be back soon, hopefully with a slightly shorter video. Bye for now. Particular category, or they would have fitten. So I am very, very excited to give Down River